I read Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. This is reread for me. It is a kind of horror book, I guess, set in contemporaneous Japan. And I think the thing about horror that the genre gives us is this view of the world that encompasses or focuses in on all of the things that are not okay to talk about in real life. So you take you know you talk about clowns, is the one that I always think of because of Stephen King's It. Clowns are happy. They're a wonderful performer, giving their time and effort, to make people laugh and be happy. And then what we don't talk about in that whole situation is the way in which a clown is creepy and weird and somehow non-human. In emphasizing the happiness, it denies all of the ways in which the clown is scary and makes us feel creeped out. And so in the horror story, you get to focus in on all that and minimize whatever the aspect of the normal way that we talk about things. And so I think in this story, you have situations like an elementary school environment where that's supposed to be a really nurturing and safe place that, leads to empowerment and is part of growing up and leaving childhood and becoming an adult, and can, be the place that fosters long-term positive relationships between children and adults, and then also a building of self-esteem for the child. These are all of the things that are okay to talk about in society when we talk about elementary schools for children. What's not okay to talk about is adult supremacy, the way that children are being groomed and molded and abused and neglected and left unheard and being dropped off at a school so that their parents can feel a sense of relief and release from the responsibility of being the parent, and the ways in which it creates opportunities for teachers to exploit and abuse the children who are in their care. That is the focus of the early part of the book, Earthlings. And so the main character, Natsuki, is neglected by her parents. Like, her parents, again, the kind of horror version of parents are neglectful. They seem completely absent of any kind of actual loving relationship for her, to the point where there's a kind of psychological break inside of her from reality. And she consoles herself by creating this narrative that she has special magical powers that no one else has, and that she was given these powers by her hedgehog, I'm pretty sure the hedgehog is like a stuffed animal, but her hedgehog Paiute is like, gives her magical powers, kind of like, it makes me think of Sailor Moon. Because the hedgehog is like, I'm from another planet and I can give people powers, and I've given you powers. And so, psychologically, this is a certain kind of narcissism where she is making up an authority figure in the absence of loving parents who approves of her, who cultivates abilities in her, and it like is a stand-in, a surrogate parent, basically, that comes from her imagination. And so she's giving herself permission to be powerful and to have agency in life and all of that kind of stuff. But also it's like based on nothing, right? Like, it's just a fantasy. And all of the ways that she can disassociate from the bad situations in her life, she perceives as being magical powers. And then each summer as she's growing up, her family goes to a different part of Japan, like up in the mountains, up in the mountain country. And she visits with her cousin, who is around the same age as her, named Yu. And Yu is also neglected and abused by his parents. His mother is constantly telling him that he must be an alien because he's so weird. And Natsuki tells him, like, oh, you're probably an alien, just like my pet hedgehog is an alien. You're probably from the same planet. And he's like, yeah, I am from the same planet. And they kind of fantasize together about the ways in which they don't fit in, but they create like a story that allows them to fit in with each other. And so there's, something there about escapism, about fantasy, the way that fantasy helps us to escape from neglectful, abusive, bad situations. But since this is a horror story, we're going to not look at all of those positive aspects of escapism. We're going to look at the negative parts that we don't talk about, that we won't admit to. And those add up basically to, bad behavior, deep disassociations from reality, which cut us off from all of the good things in life and hold us to a kind of virtual space that is disconnected from anything real. And so when Natsuki goes back to school, she has this professor that all of the girls are kind of swooning over because he's so handsome. And that really what that's about is that he's just very young. He seems like he's 19, 20, maybe 21 at the most. And he, in his like spare time while he's going to university, is teaching elementary kid school aged people, like about basic mathematics and stuff like that. And so it's like extra credit, a little bit of money for him, whatever. But I think the real reason that he's there is to groom little girls and then abuse them, because he targets Natsuki and she gets groped by him a couple of times. He puts her in some really uncomfortable situations that she doesn't like. She tries to tell different people in her life that this is happening to her, and all of them in various ways, like either blow it off, they call her a liar, they say that she's misunderstanding, or they tell her that she wants it and that there's something wrong with her, that this is happening to her. And so she has no way to get out of the situation, basically. And he sexually abuses her to the point where she completely disassociates from her body. And she kind of interprets this moment as a kind of like ability to astrally project, to have her soul leave her body, and that she's like achieved a new magical ability. And so I think this part of the book for me is like, it's really shocking. It's really disturbing. And it also like makes me feel very protective of Natsuki and very close to her and very sad and, horrified and whatnot. And I think that's really important for the way that the rest of the book goes, because basically Murata has built up a kind of bank of goodwill in what happens here, which is like maybe a weird way to say it, but to see this lonely, poor child who's just trying to do her best to survive, be abused in this way, you just have feelings for her. And then Murata uses the rest of the book to kind of spend that goodwill, if you will. By the end of the book, you're just kind of horrified with where Natsuki ends up. And I'm kind of laughing because there's a way in which as much as the book is horrible and it has all of these dark ideas and themes, there's an absurdity to the whole thing as well. And there are lots of moments where I laugh at the really, really horrible, crazy stuff that happens. But I think that's part of the horror genre too, is there's an absurdity about life and the things that we take seriously and the way that we look at the world, that when you flip the whole thing on its head, a different kind of absurdity shows up that underlines the regular absurdity in the world, that like all of the ways that we're not willing to admit that, like all of this is made up, all of our society and the way that we do things is made up. It's not real in the sense of like, the laws of gravity and magnetism and things like that. It's just not the same. And a lot of it's weird, but we don't think it's weird because we're just so used to it. And so when you see somebody doing weird stuff in a story, it just kind of reveals the way in which life is strange. Like why do we do what we do? There's not really great reasons for it. It's just we've gotten used to it. So after this happens and she has this deep disassociation, she's worried about her future. She feels like the teacher has taken some ownership over parts of her body and they feel like they don't function for her anymore. And she's worried that if she has to go back to him and have this happen to her some more, then she's going to lose the rest of her body. Like none of her body will function how it's supposed to, and she will die or something like that. And so to save her body, when they go back to see her cousin again, she proposes marriage to him. And she says, the only way that this is going to work is if we have sex together, because then I will have chosen what's happening to my body, and that will make it so that whatever happens to my body after that, it will be protected magically by me and by you. And her cousin is like taken aback by this and not sure about it, but goes along. He wants to protect her and make her happy, but he doesn't really understand. He's just a child himself. And then the two of them have sex and they are discovered by her family. And this causes a huge scandal in the family. And now suddenly everybody cares, what is going on with these kids who they never pay attention to. And heavy punishments come in and all kinds of worry about like, why would you do this? Who taught you to do this? And on like that, when nobody cared before that she's being abused by her teacher, right? Then she's returned back to the neighborhood. She's going to be forced to go back to school. And instead, she breaks into her teacher's house. And has this elaborate fantasy that she's convinced that this witch is trying to kill her, and the witch has taken over her teacher's body, and that's why he's being abusive to her. It's like he's possessed by a demon or something like that. And so she's going to magically fight against the witch and get rid of its presence, and the teacher will be a nice teacher after that to her. And this magical fight amounts to stabbing the witch over and over again, which is clearly like a fantasy to cover up the act of murdering her teacher. She's like deeply disassociated through the whole thing. So there's like a deep irony to this part of the book, but a lot of the part of the book too. Like you kind of have to like read between the lines to see what exactly is happening, but it's like pretty clear in this part that she just cannot face the fact that she murders her teacher, but she does it in order to survive going to school. She doesn't see any alternative because she's appealed to authority figures. Everybody says she's crazy. So this is kind of the last ditch desperate option. And she pretty much gets away with it. She throws away the evidence and goes back home. And at that point, her hedgehog tells her, you've defeated the witch. There's no more reason for you to have powers anymore. I'm going to take the powers back. And oh, by the way, you were always an alien like me, but the spaceship can't come and get you. And so you're stranded here on Earth. You're going to have to find a way to live among the Earthlings. Then there's a time skip of about 20 years, and Natsuki is an adult woman in her 30s. She is married to a guy named Tomoya. And this part of the book kind of examines, in just the same way as the rest of, the horror examines the flip side of things, the flip side of marriage. And so on one level, marriage is portrayed as romantic and magical and connected. Or, when satirized, it's like drudgery and you're tied to someone who you are not excited about, who annoys you. But underneath all of that is a kind of social arrangement that is not too different from a roommate situation, just with opposite genders. And it doesn't have to include intimacy on an emotional or physical level. And so, like, a dysfunctional marriage can be, abusive and full of mixed signals and missed messages and stuff like that. Or it can be like this weird, kind of disturbing, asexual roommate situation between Tomoyo and Natsuki. So they're both married to each other in order to get their families off their backs and to appear more normal, which is already like weird behavior. So there's a kind of, like I said, the rest of the book is kind of paying out Natsuki's goodwill, and there's like a perversity and just weird behavior here where this terrible thing happened to her when she was a girl and she was neglected for her entire life and in a very unhealthy household. But now that she's an adult, she's not looking for any kind of fix to that. She's not like going to therapy or something. Instead, she found someone who is equally dysfunctional as her and got married to them, which again, like maybe that is a thing that people do in their 20s and 30s, is just find someone with a compatible mental illness and bam, now you're married. Tomoyo's mental illness seems to come from his relationship with his mother, where his mother forced him to bathe with her until his late teenage years. And so he has all kinds of hang-ups about bodies and contact and the expectations on him that have to do with, having a family, falling in love, having girlfriends and things like that. He also needs to speak to a therapist, but, you're not going to do that in a horror story, or I guess it could go like really, really wrong in a horror story. But one of the things that they bond over is they talk about the rest of Japanese society, and I guess, just all of the world society, really, that people are supposed to procreate. They're supposed to basically contribute as an instrument, as an object to this factory, which produces more people. So this is an idea that Natsuki had earlier in the book when she was a little girl, but she's carried it with her into adulthood, and she's told Tomoyo about it. And he agrees that everybody wants they put a lot of pressure on you when you're young to find someone, get married, have sex, and have some kids. And then people would back off. They call this life the factory. They're a part of it. The product is children. The product is society. And it helps them to consider themselves in a disassociated way. So like Natsuki is always trying to disassociate from her body because of the abuse done to her. And so she's kind of projecting that disassociation out on everyone in the population, saying that like none of you are really people. You're all just objects. You're all just being manipulated by a system that wants you to procreate. And so all of your senses about, like your happiness, your sadness, it's all lies that obscure the fact that you're actually just a empty vessel that is supposed to be filled up by this factory system. Natsuki has told Tomoyo about her time in the place with her cousin, although she hasn't told him the truth about what happened there. And he kind of builds up this fantasy world around that place as being some kind of utopia or perfect or something. And so he really wants to go there. And since she is married now, her family is okay with her going up there. However, her cousin is currently living in the house by himself because he inherited it when the grandmother died. And so they go back to the place, and this kind of gives a parallel structure between the first part and second part, I think, where they keep going back to this place and significant things happen. And so there's a kind of setup that happens in the normal quote unquote society out there in more urban Japan, and then we retreat to the rural mountainous Japan, and that's when the big turning points happen. And so Yu is still living up there, like I said, and they get there and they meet Yu, and they talk to him about like being an alien and not conforming and not fitting in. And you basically tells him like, we were kids when all that happened. I'm not really an alien. None of us are really aliens. There's no such thing as magical powers, and we just are supposed to accept reality and do our best to cope with the bad things that happen to us and get on with life. And that is not what Natsuki wants to hear at all. It's basically, you is conforming. Like, he wants to give into society. He wants to become quote unquote normal. And Natsuki is kind of like, we're aliens. We can't be normal. We can try to blend in with the Earthlings, but at the end of the day, we're never actually going to be like them. And then Tomoyo kind of like freaks out, I guess, and just keeps pushing more and more and more to disassociate from the rest of, modern society. And he wants to become non-human in some sense. Tomoya believes that he has also become an alien at this point, and he kind of urges Yu to remember that he's an alien and to embrace it. And like I said, Yu is like, that none of that is real. And so I think at this part, we really start to see the alarming way that clinging to kind of fantasy, to disassociation, using that coping mechanism that helped you when you were a kid to escape from a situation that was impossible for you to escape from, for the most part, really, really starts to harm your life and destroy any chance that you have of becoming the social creature that humans are kind of designed by nature to be. And Tomoya doesn't want to be human. He doesn't want to conform. He wants to like leave the planet and go to the other planet that they're from. But since they're not really from another planet, all of this just kind of like takes away the connections that they have to other people in their life outside of these three people and make life much, much harder. And they actually like just give up trying to have jobs. Eventually Yu joins in with them. They give up having a house, like a place to stay. They steal food from the supermarket and all kinds of things like that. And then at the end of the book, her teacher's parents show up and they know the truth about the murder and they want to kill her in return. And she stones them to death. Well, what ends up happening that Natsuki, she kills them when they come in because she feels like they're from quote unquote the factory and they're trying to pull them, the aliens, back into the earthly lifestyle, and that they have somehow achieved a kind of utopian situation that only they, the aliens, can understand, and they don't want to be part of the earthling system, and that this person wanted to kill them anyway. And so she murders this person again, like the way that she murdered his son. And then to make it even crazier and worse, they feed on the human body and like parboil it and all of this stuff. And so these are the ways in which I was talking about how Natsuki's goodwill gets spent by the end of the novel. She has become like fully not human to us in the way that she is monstrous. And so she's not merely a victim of abuse, but becomes through the abuse and her reaction to it, a killer and a person who doesn't see herself as fully human. And somehow psychically it kind of lets her off the hook. So the book is just shocking and weird and in all the ways that I think a horror book should be, but this one's really unusual because there's not like a supernatural story per se going on here. There's not like some kind of incarnated evil that's hunting people down. Instead, it's just showing us all of the real weirdness in the world that we don't want to look straight at, and putting characters in it that we care about. And then when we follow them further along that trail, we find ourselves sympathizing for monstrous actions and people. So it's a really neat trick. It's really outside of the usual boundaries of horror fiction, and it feels more literary to me, but at the same time needs that kind of mentality of horror to go in there and experience it the quote unquote right way, I guess, or the way that I think people should interpret it.